Hi, Jerry.
Well, I can't say good morning unless I'm on mute. So good morning. Yes, we're it so far.
Oh, no, got one more. We're big group now.
Okay.
Ah.
Hello, Mark.
Good morning.
How are you?
Good
Chag Sameach.
noon. Chag Sameach. Happy Chol Hamoed.
Well, thank you. I'm trying to get rid of something that's interfering. Hold on. Okay. I think, okay.
Looking like an old men's group.
Cindy, so why do you have a 2?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Maybe because I have both a computer and an iPad. But
Okay. So coffee brewing.
following up on Bill's comment, as Mark, this is an opportunity for you to be the baby in the group.
It's been a long time. That's good.
With this group, I don't think that's too hard.
It's a load more.
I remember when I got to Shereth Israel and I'm sitting there in a staff meeting and looking and saying, I'm the youngest guy here. Yeah, those days have gone.
Yeah.
People, just another minute or two.
There's nothing wrong with being the oldest guy in the room if you're still the oldest guy in the room.
That, yes, indeed. As long as you're there, it's all good.
Right.
Somebody else is here. I think we're getting a female member of the group to join us. Everybody doing well?
So far.
Not holidayed out yet. All right. I've got my coffee, so I'm ready to go. Hi, Diane. How's California? For those of you who don't know, that Diane is Vicky's mom.
And her dad is coming. Hi. Was there a printout for this week?
There is, but I don't think there's a lot on it.
Okay. Okay, we're good.
There may be one reading kind of thing. So,
We're fine.
all right. So we've done 2 weeks of sort of an overview, and now we're going to get down to some more specifics in process. And we're going to talk about today the shift from biblical and temple times to Torah and rabbinic times. That's our goal for the day. So you have the fall of Judah and the destruction of the temple in 586 before the Common Era, the first temple. In a lot of ways, that was a watershed moment for everything to do with Bible and biblical religion. not only do the people themselves go into exile, but in certain ways, a lot of Judaism also goes into exile because a lot of the laws of Torah cannot be performed outside of the land of Israel. So it's a brand new concept they've got to deal with. So the people go into exile, and as well as a lot of ways in which Judaism is observed does so as well. And it becomes an unprecedented test of Israel's faith. Old forms are gone. Hopes are disappointed, morale is cracking, and Israel is looking for some element around which the people can rally to keep them unified. Judaism, as they know it, is gone. The Holy Land, the festivals, the temple, the priests were exclusively Israelite, all in one cloth. There was no distinction. It was the land, it was the way of life. It wasn't just a religion, it was a way of life that went beyond. You take one thread out of that and the whole thing, you run danger of the whole thing collapsing. And you no longer, as a result, have a national culture, which has been a part of Judaism all along. So culture starts to disappear. However, what's fascinating is despite the fact that they've been sent into Babylonia in exile, not only did the Israelite religion not die, it actually had an unexpected resurgence. All right, what was a political loss ultimately became a religious gain. It's during this period and just after the exile that Israel opens its doors to the ranks of non-Israelites. So before this, if you were living in the land, in order to become one of the Israelite people, you lived in the land and you assimilated to the national religion, but it was like being an American. It was just part of living in the land. That's the way we behave. By the virtue of the Babylonian experience, however, new avenues are added, and it's really here that any potential for conversion really emerges. Before, you simply just morphed into the peoplehood. Now you've got this idea that one's status is no longer determined by birth and location, but a factor of thought and deed. And that is a significant shift in the ancient world. Judaism goes from being the religion of a people to being a people of one religion. I'm watching it. When I teach in person, I watch for visual cues as to how people are responding. So I'll take a pause and look and do that here too as well. If there are any questions, please feel free to ask. Within the Torah, the centrality of the priesthood is indisputable. The major institution is the temple, the personnel are the priests, and they're surrounded by kings and prophets. That is the world of the Bible. After that, the new era that is going to emerge is what we call the Rabbinic period. All right. Now, it's very interesting, and a point to be made is that with the Rabbinic period, there's no longer a caste system. It's no longer passed down generation to generation. As a matter of fact, very few of the prominent rabbis were born of famous rabbis. They emerged themselves. Indeed, some of the most famous actually came from converts. They were descendants of converts. You've got Hillel and Shammai and Rekiva and Meir. And so as a result, for the first time, it's not paternity, but piety that becomes decisive. These are all effects of no longer living in Israel. All right, so there is a reading here. I took it right out of Pirkei Avot 1:1. It's the first chapter, first verse of Pirkei Avot. And if you have it, great, I'll read it. So if you don't have it, you can hear it. It says, Moses received the Torah at Sinai. He transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets to the men of the great assembly. All right, rabbinic authority goes from Moses through the prophets and on. Who's missing from that description?
Priests.
The priests. There is no mention of the transition of Torah through the priests. And it is deliberate. It's a deliberate undermining of the priestly claim to authority by eliminating any reference to them in this historical event. In such a world, what has happened is temple is being replaced by Torah as the number one pillar upon which the world stands. I'll pause there. Any comments or thoughts? Seeing none, I will proceed. So let's look at the world of exile. All right. Common to all of the surrounding Near Eastern religions was the centrality of the cult, the sacrificial system, as a need of the gods. They needed that system. All right, ancient Near Eastern gods would no more likely allow their temple to be destroyed than an army would let its supply line disappear. Without the temple, they would go away. Without the supply lines, you can't succeed. Temple destruction in the ancient world not only indicated the impotence of the local god, but the presence of one that was more powerful. Your God beat my God. Okay? And so that was the way in which the ancient world functioned. A destroyed temple, as a general rule, by a foreign army would trigger mass desertion to the cause of the conquering God. That's the way the ancient world worked. And so with Jerusalem devastated and the temple destroyed, the ancient people, the Jews, the Israelites, if they were like the others, would be saying, if he can't save his own temple, how can he save us? And so the question becomes how and why. Why are we sitting here? Why are we having a conversation? It shouldn't be happening. All right. Why and how have we maintained a distinctive religious identity, even though we were exiled to Babylonia? That's really the question. Any thoughts? Anybody? I'd love to hear before I go into any thoughts on by others. No idea, Russ.
We get the rabbi side of the story, but do we have any idea at all as to how many of the people actually did join the conquering religion?
Well, it is likely, first of all, we know from the Northern Kingdom, all right, that most of either one of two things happened. When Assyria conquered the Northern Kingdom, either what they did is they dispersed the Jews all over the land. They didn't allow them to continue living as a community in Assyria. And so many of those people disappeared, plain and simply disappeared. The other probability is a good number of them just moved back to Israel, or moved south into the Southern Kingdom and lost their identity and became part of the Southern Kingdom. All right. With Babylonia, they allowed the Jewish community, when they transferred them in whole. And so they set up a whole new distinct community of Judaism. That was the enabler. That's why in the north it disappeared, in the south it didn't. It had to do with the method of the conquering army. How many of them disappeared into? God knows. We don't have any way of knowing that. To some extent, the difference is the relationship between God and the world in terms of God not needing. Our perspective was never that God needed the sacrifices. It was our need to relate to God that was at play, not God's need of the sacrifices. God is not dependent on the cult from a Jewish perspective. To the contrary, the cult is simply a manifestation of man's attempt to relate to God, and man can destroy that relationship. It's man who has the ability to destroy the relationship. And so, for example, if the temple, the institution of the temple, which is meant to connect man and God, actually facilitates sinning, the temple itself can become a source of desecration of God's name. All right, I'll give you an example. I promise, if anybody who's ever run a budget for a synagogue or been on a board, it's expensive. The expenses involved in maintaining the temple drama and ritual were great. Very, very expensive. And so the wealthy and the powerful had tremendous influence in that world. It was a necessity. Some people would call that an unholy alliance. I'm not ready to go quite that far, but I've come across those kinds of labelings. In such a world, though, the temple cult can actually prevent and block access of the disenfranchised to the religion. If that happens, then the temple becomes a source of sinning. So, for example, again, I'll use the modern times, all right? Yes, we need to turn to our wealthy and we ask for money and we ask for donations and it keeps us going. But rarely does anything that we provide keep the general public out. All right? The money helps us be able to provide services to the larger community for those who can't pay. But we don't then have lots of programming with only to the wealthy. That's where the synagogue itself can turn into a source of sin itself. We're no longer providing access. Ideally, a synagogue or a temple is a religious symbol, points to something beyond itself. And when morality is compromised, the symbol is no longer functional, but it's also counterproductive. The Talmud says, it's the following, it says, one is not to revere the sanctuary, but God who gave the commandment concerning the sanctuary. The synagogue, the sanctuary, the congregation are all the means. They're not the goal. All right, the goal is relationship to God. Everything else is a means to get there. Certainly it's true of the temple. All right. In this model, if the destruction of the temple does not reflect God's impotence, in other words, the temple is destroyed, therefore we have a weak God. If that's not the case, the alternative is to understand it as God's punishment. And that is the prophetic line. Right? It's not that God is weak, it's that he's expressing his dissatisfaction with the behavior of the Jews. The loss of the temple as a new social situation certainly creates new problems with regard to the process of atonement. And in my course of my life, I've certainly had numbers of Christians who have said to me, okay, you need blood for a sacrifice to be able to be atoned for. In Christianity, we have Jesus. Where's your temple? How do you have atonement without it? Our response has been that we've emerged beyond that. We've grown beyond that. It's our relationship with God. We can work through those things in lots of other ways, Yom Kippur, etc. But in the ancient world, that was the concept. So you've got this problem for the priests. They're on foreign soil where sacrifices are forbidden. The priest has no social structures, no temple, and therefore is losing his status, and the whole priesthood becomes vulnerable in that world. All right. And so what happens is you need alternative schemes for atonement and for all the kinds of things that were being expressed in the temple. There's a need for new models to achieve the same goals. If you were living in Jerusalem at the time before the temple was destroyed, you couldn't help but feel the centrality of the temple, of the priesthood, of the sacrificial system. It was physically in your face. There was a pageantry. It's like watching a coronation of a king of England, which we're all going to be glued to our TVs in whatever couple months from now. That pageantry dominated the world, and it blocked out the potential for alternative understandings. But with the introduction of exile in Babylonia, where none of that is present, counter theologies begin to take root. And with that, the centrality of revelation becomes core as mediated through Torah. Without temple, Torah takes on more meaning. It may have been understood, may have been advocated before as well, but it now is receiving a level of a degree that it never had in the past. Torah was secondary to temple until the temple was destroyed. All right, comments, thoughts? Now I want you to imagine the following. you've got this group in Babylonia that is developing alternative ways of living, of addressing God, of interacting with religion in general. Cyrus comes along and says, by the way, there's also people back in Israel maintaining a lot of the ways, the old ways. Cyrus comes along and says, I'll let you rebuild the temple. If you want to go back, you can go ahead, have a good time. Most of the people don't leave Babylonia. They stay there. Most of the people do not return to Israel in the same way that when in 1948 Israel was created, all of us are sitting here in America because our lives are good. Our family is here. Our way of life is here. Our community is here. Most of the Jews that were sent to Babylonia stayed there. But nonetheless, a significant number do return to Israel, and they bring with them this new series of ways of behaviors, and they encounter a group of Jews living in the land who are still holding on to the older ways of the belief of the restoration of the temple, and that should be the way. And what you've got is a dynamic tension that leads to growth within Judaism. Two different groups coming together with now different views. There's no longer the centralization. When the second temple, I'm going to jump ahead just very briefly. The second temple is destroyed. This quest for atonement and expiation and reinstatement of divine grace leads to further and further study of Torah. So what you've got is it begins with the first temple in the Babylonian exile, and Torah becomes more and more critical over time, and it gets becomes fully centralized with the destruction of the second temple. And once that happens, you've got new leaders who are rising. You've got, instead of a priestly group of people who are by birth in a separate category, you now have a new kind of priesthood called the Rabbinic, in which an entree has to do not with your birth status, but with your study. All right. What is your competency of Torah? And once the link from the divine to the human becomes a book instead of a building, you have an alternative pecking order that develops. Any thoughts? Very quiet today. Sandy. Yep.
Really a question: when the second temple was built, and about what year was it built? But the other part of the question really, did they then return to the old sacrificial cult?
Yeah, the priest, yes. So the priests resumed the sacrificial cult, but what you were seeing were there were also started to begin to see temples that emerge, synagogues that emerge around the community, and people were praying. And this is, if you look at Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy is all about centralization, that there shouldn't be other places. But after the destruction of the first temple, they did start to show up.
Good, thanks.
What is important for the rabbis to convey here? Let me use the example in American law. All American law somehow theoretically, conceptually, is based on the Constitution. It may be 7 steps away, but it can't contradict the initial document. And it has in some way theoretically be built upon. It's a layering. That's the intent. All right. Rabbinic accounts regarding the ritual practice diverged a great deal from the biblical times. Okay. They had no choice. All right. But they had to sell it as if it was continuous, even though in reality, in many ways, it was discontinuous. Lou.
This may be a little bit off timing, Mark, and if it is, to postpone this, but when did the oral law become something that became important?
Hold on. I'll get there. That's a great question, and we will get there, I promise. So you've got a group of rabbis introducing a new understanding of Judaism, but claiming that nothing has really changed. They want us to believe that the Mishnah is simply an application of the old ways It's the natural growth product out of it. All right, so actually, let me take your comment, and let me add on. I'll deal with it now. If I'm looking to make it looking to make it appear continuous, what am I going to do? Now, I'm speaking as a historian here. What I'm going to do is suggest that the folk ways that people have been living over the last few years were handed down as Sinai. All right, I retrospectively attribute all the rabbinic laws to having been given at Sinai as well. That's called the oral law. But they were the ways of the people that were existing, but there was no law set to it in terms of history. It is only with the codification of the Mishnah and in the process, in 200 CE, that they looked and said, you know what? These are the ways of the people. They were always the ways of the people. God set them down at Sinai. It was a retrospective attribution. Does that bother anybody? Does that sit comfortably with everybody? Okay. Obviously, we have no right-wing Orthodox Jews sitting in the group, or I'd have been smacked by now. All right.
What would they say?
Well, they would say to you that all the oral law was handed down at Sinai, that everything I'm saying, they would say to you that the Mishnah, for example, most modern scholars would suggest to you that the Mishnah really in being written was a response to the concerns of the time when it was being written. Okay. An Orthodox Jew would say to you, no, God gave all that information and he predicted it, and he gave it in advance, and the conversations of the rabbis of the Mishnah are simply the fulfillment of what God said was going to happen.
I see.
Okay. The modern Jews would look at it differently and say this was the struggle of the rabbis to keep Judaism alive and reinterpretation of Torah, and it adapted to the needs of the time, much like we do in today's world. That you don't find, for an example, any discussion of the use of electricity on Shabbat in the temple, in the Talmud. Not going to find it there. We have to reinterpret. You're not going to find heart transplant issues in the Torah. You won't find it in the Talmud. There's a need to modernize and update the text. And that's from a liberal Jewish perspective. That's what we consider the Mishnah, and as the first step, and then the Talmud builds upon that, and then the codes build upon that, and it keeps building the same way American law builds one upon the other. And along the way, Sandy, if I say anything that's inaccurate in my analogy, let me know. So far, so good. All right. The Mishnah in its presentation, how everything I've just said, wants us to believe that nothing has changed. It's written as if this was the natural outcome. Some would say that, for example, someone asked the question on Sunday, could this have been God's plan? That the destruction of the temple was necessary for Torah to emerge, and the whole thing was planned, and therefore it's all written down in Mishnah because that was God's plan all along. Anything's possible. All right. So let's take a look at reading number 2. Does anybody have it and willing to read it for us? No, if not, I can. Okay. This is written by Rabbi Mortimer Ostow, and he says, to those who are committed to a religious life, the existence of a crisis makes observance even more necessary. It is vital to retain the forms of observance and worship that has signified continuity with the past and that protect against discontinuity. Maintaining one's ways of life under hostile attack serves also to sustain one's self-esteem, which is always at risk under pressure. The way in which we understand our lives at such moments and our sense-making is at stake. If you were in my Melton class a number of years ago, I don't know if you'll remember the story I told, but I'm going to share a story I told there as well. In the 1950s, there was a newspaper article describing a group of people who believed that the world was coming to an end. They believed that a spaceship would come and save the true believers. And the Times reported that this group of people was going to meet at just before midnight because in a parking lot somewhere in New York, and a spaceship would arrive at midnight and take away all the true believers prior to the destruction of the world. Okay? Psychologist sees this in the newspaper and says, I gotta go. I gotta see this. All right? Midnight arrives, and guess what doesn't? No spaceship. Guess what doesn't happen? The world is not destroyed. What do people who are standing in a parking lot at midnight who have believed that the world was about to be destroyed, how do they make sense of that? They have two options. I'm an idiot. I'm standing in a parking lot waiting for a spaceship. That's one potential response. That's not what they did. Instead, what they did is say, because we were true believers, the world has been saved. In crisis, we reinterpret the data to fit our pre-existing understandings. That's a very, first of all, in terms of Christianity, when I heard this in a class I took years ago, and I'm sitting in a room full of Christians, what's going through my head is, does anybody not see the death of Jesus here? Am I the only one picking up on this? I have a God. He's killed. What do I do with that? A whole new religion developed out of it because they couldn't stand there and say, well, my God was killed. I must have been an idiot. But that's an aside. And it was my reaction as a 25-year-old sitting in a class. All right. But it's true in terms of how we make sense of the world in general. And so when the temple is destroyed and everything about it is gone, in order to maintain our identities as individuals and as people, we reinterpret the data and it becomes, we are responsible. We failed and God punished us. And if we can just double down in certain ways in our relationship with God, that will solve the problem. And that theology has been consistent within Judaism. It's probably why we're still sitting here. And it was a consistently held theology until the Holocaust. And then most thinkers post-Holocaust have rejected that kind of thinking because there's no way to make sense of the events that happened. To say that we were sinning and therefore 6 million died just doesn't work for most of us. All right, I'm going to stop. Any kind of comments on that?
Yes, can I just ask, how do you reconcile the destruction of the world with Noah and his ark? In other words, maybe 6 million people died then also.
Yeah, right. And as a matter of fact, one of the sermons I'm going to give in a couple of weeks talks, when we get to Noah, talks about the possibility that God might be a learning God. We have a God there that describes very clearly God regrets what he did. So beyond that, I'm not sure how to explain it.
But wouldn't that be the analogy to the Holocaust?
Yeah, that would be an analogy. Another would be, I could look at the destruction of the temple and the fact that 1/3 of the Jewish people was killed in the century around the destruction of the temple. That highly parallels the Holocaust. 1/3 of the entire population was murdered. There are moments, okay? But in post-Holocaust, again, we have far more knowledge. We have far more awareness of what was going on than they did in the ancient world. And that kind of theology just seems to fall apart. And so even by the way, and when I say that, Norman Lamb, who was the head of Yeshiva University for many years, is the one who literally came out and said that theology can't work anymore. So I'm not just speaking through a liberal lens on that kind of comment. There's something else that changes in this process. If you were to ask the average Judean to identify the major holidays, he would undoubtedly point to Passover, Sukkot, Shavuot. There were these throngs of people coming to Jerusalem and making pilgrimages. All right, there's pomp and circumstance. There's the songs of the Levites. There's ministrations of the priests. There's prostrations of the worshipers. All of this would leave an indelible mark. You know what they wouldn't have cited? Shabbat. Not that it didn't exist, it wasn't core. In Babylonia, however, the situation is different. You have none of that. There simply are no pilgrimages. There's no temple. There's no place to do any of that. And so the land and the temple cult have vanished, and the Jews need something to claim as a way of building community. They're no longer coming together in the same way to give it distinctiveness, and that becomes the law, Torah, and with that, the frequency of reading of the law, which occurred on Shabbat. That combination of Shabbat now being a core community opportunity, as well as the time in which we learn this new way of living that's focused on Torah instead of temple, unites the people and makes Shabbat core to the very mission of what Judaism is about. Shabbat is a time to focus on Torah. It occasioned and it heightens the awareness that God is God. It's a day in which the exiles become the people of God. Essentially, what you've got is law now creating community. Anybody upset by that? Okay, good. Wow, everybody's really happy today. That's how I'm going to take it. All right, what you've got now is the experience of the exile sows the seeds that allows Judaism to shift from into a book, teacher, Shabbat-centered religion, in contrast to a temple, priest, sacrifice-centered religion. We have shifted the focus and the way we interact. All right. All, by the way, while marketing it as it's all continuous. We haven't changed anything if you look at the Mishnah. Minor modifications. We've just angled it different. So I said to you before, when the Jews return from Babylonia, there's conflict that arises. You've got those who stayed, those that were exiled, all coming together, two different ways of life that exist. Much of that conflict from the time of Ezra and Nehemiah up to the destruction of the Second Temple is really based on ideological differences between those two groups. And to some degree, the sectarianism that you see in the centuries before the destruction of the temple, that is the outcome of that conflict. What is the focus is the issue, all right? What's the locus of what makes something sacred? You've got the high priest group is fighting for dear life to keep the focus on temple and priesthood, even in the absence of temple, because we believe it's going to be rebuilt. And you've got the returnees saying, no, we want to expand access to the holiness outside of the temple. Torah becomes that guide. It can move, it travels, it goes with us. We're going to publicly read it so that people have access to it. All right. And it can apply to all of life. That is the tension that leads to the sectarianism. And we're going to talk about the different sects next week. Yes, Lou.
During the first temple period, I know that the kings were supposed to keep Torah with them for their reference. But is there any evidence of public readings other than like every 7 years? I think it says in Deuteronomy every 7 years the Torah is supposed to be read. Is there any other public reading of Torah that's in evidence?
So I'm not sure I'm not sure when they use the word Torah in the Bible like that, or in the biblical stories, that it means the same thing. I think it means just whatever the law structure was, because I don't even think the book of Deuteronomy existed until Josiah. He claims to have found a new book, a lost book. So the use of the word Torah probably meant something very different. And it really is, and we talked about this last week, it really isn't until about 300 before the Common Era that there was an agreement on what is Torah. So yes, and then whatever it was, they read every 7 years, but I'm not sure we're talking about the same thing. We're using the same label, but I'm not sure it means the same thing. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Exodus 19. Okay. Just before the giving of the Torah, God charges the people to become a mamlechet kohanim, a kingdom of priests. All of them are to be priests. The entire nation of Israel is charged with becoming a kohen. This assumes that the priesthood is coextensive with the people, that they are the same thing. And yet, several chapters later, Moses is instructed to install Aaron and his sons to serve as priests. That happens in chapter 28. 19, all the people are to be priests. By 28, 9 chapters later, Aaron and his people and his family are to be the priests. So the question becomes, what has changed? What happened in those 9 chapters? So I've come across 2 responses to that. One, many people underscore that only after the people had succumbed to the idea of worshiping an object, meaning the golden calf, only then does God concede and say, you know what, we'll have a temple. The temple is an admission that the people failed. They need something concrete. That's one answer here. In this model, it's reckoned as a concession to human frailty and the need of human beings for a tangible symbol, but it's only a symbol, and then I'll take comments in a second, because the Bible says to us in Exodus 25, construct for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell among, not it, them. The temple is a place where God's presence can be found in the people, not in the temple. Israel is the temple of God. That's one answer. The second is, why are the people no longer everybody a priest? That first answer is you need priests. Once you build a temple, you need priests. All right. And so the second special group. Second answer is the failure of the people to respond to revelation. God comes down with the intent of speaking to the entire nation. And they say, wait a minute, we don't want to hear, talk to Moses. We don't want to hear this. It's too much for us. And at that point, terrified, they request Moses be the mediator. And as a result, the people lose their ability to serve as priests in the world. And you only have a selected group that serves that role. Any thoughts on that?
Would you say that again?
Two
Why
reasons.
the failure of the people to respond to revelation?
So in other
were
words, when God
frightened,
comes down, his intent is to make them all into a nation of
Yes,
priests.
I
He's
understand,
going to
but,
speak directly to everybody.
and people didn't want. their
And
next-
we're told the people say, it's scary. This is terrifying. All right. Moses, bring us the message. And so from this perspective, there's a rejection of the priesthood by the larger population. These are theories. But we do know that when God first speaks in 19, he says that you will be a mamlechet kohanim, a nation of priests. And yet somewhere along the way, that's not how it plays out or didn't play out. Okay.
He's in a crisis there.
What's that? Is
You know,
anybody?
that- That's certainly how it is today. I mean, totally.
Well, what's that?
That the people didn't want all that responsibility. Somebody else do it for me.
Yeah, well, right. Vicarious responsibility is a human trait in general. It's not something we Jews are specialized in. So in a sense, what's happened is they gave it away, as you've just described. I don't want this responsibility. All right. And so there's a need for a building, because the golden calf, we need something tangible. Once you have something tangible, you need people to lead it, and the people rejected hearing the word of God. These are all theories. I'm not telling you this is fact. I'm trying to understand why we have one verse and another verse, and they seem to contradict.
Mark,
But yes.
some of this because, we're looking at this from today and our mindset and our educated minds.
Right.
Back then, people just weren't that educated and they were frightened of their own shadows.
Yeah, I think that's probably very, very true. I mean, again, we are projecting backwards. And it does not make anything I've said accurate. All I can point out is that there seems to be a conflict between what it says in Exodus 19 and what occurs in Exodus 28. We're left to make sense of it. That's called Midrash. All right. And we can have 15 contradictory forms of Midrash on text. That is, I talked about that last week. Midrash does not need to be consistent. Law needs to be consistent. Midrash doesn't. And so what we have is, once the temple is destroyed, we have a new problem. Okay, now we no longer have a priesthood, but the rabbis understand that as opportunity, because now that was God's intent all along. There's the continuity to allow that which was contained within the temple to now explode out into the world, and the Jewish people can now take on the role of priests to the world through teaching Torah. And the genius of Rabbinic Judaism is expressed in presenting what was innovation as renovation. It's new, but it's continuous. All right. And so they would say to you, for example, the destruction of the temple, all of this was going to happen. All the destruction of the temple did was hasten it. It's like Zoom. We were going to be able to have these kinds of meetings at some point in the future. COVID made it happen faster, but it was inevitable. Might have taken another 20 years, might have taken 30 years, who knows? This was going to be a reality. COVID made it happen. The rabbis would say to you, the shift to Torah was the intent all along. The fact that the temple was destroyed was simply something that made it happen faster. In what their aim was now is to make life into a surrogate temple by turning all of life into a religious experience. And this was done through a particular technique. They're called blessings. All right. You have newly minted blessings. Every time you enjoy something in the world, every time you experience something in the world, it is accompanied by something that elevates the moment to a godly experience. And so everything, we have blessings about going to the bathroom. Right? We have blessings that recognize God in everything we do. And that is the response to taking what was centralized and dispersing it to every day into all our lives. We have mitzvot now that drive us. It's an opportunity that sacredness can no longer be spatially contained. Right? The world has become God's temple, and Israel returns to its role as the priests, as the Or L'Goyim, as the examples of how everybody should be living. So the rabbis have taken what was said in Genesis 19 and said, now that the temple is destroyed, we're going to fulfill that. We are going to be a mamlechet kohanim. All right. It says, I have the here quote, holiness was not given to the priests alone, the rabbis believe, but to the priests, to the Levites, and to the rest of Israel, as it says in Leviticus 19:1. speak to the whole community of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy. So from the rabbi's perspective, this was all preordained. The temple was a temporary punishment. I'm surprised nobody's saying anything. Okay. They went so far as to, yeah, Sandy, go ahead.
I excuse the cynicism. I mean, a cynical way of looking at it is look, we got to sell this.
Yeah.
And we got to sell this to the people. And what's the best way to sell it to the people is, hey, you know, God intended this. It was all along, and you know, get with the program.
That's exactly it. And that's why they, based on Lou asked the question before, that's why they had to say the oral law was given at Sinai too. This is continuous. They had to market it, Russ.
You implied even more. You said that there was the temple was the distraction.
Yes.
But the line was continuous. The temple got in the way for a while, but now we're back on the path.
That they would not have said that, but that there's a logic to it in a sense in how you look back on it. The temple was you look back at that first midrash I cited, was a response to the people needing a physical object, the golden calf. It's only at that point that God turns around and says, okay, build a tabernacle, build a temple. But the initial intent, if you read it through this lens, and I'm giving you one historical lens, and any interpretation of history is by definition an interpretation of history, okay? And that's all it is. But they needed it to be continuous. And so the message was Torah. What was the first thing created in history? If you go back and you look at rabbinic thought, before the world was created, Torah was created. Is that not marketing? It's perfect.
Said before the world was created, Torah was created.
That's midrash within rabbinic writings. Yes. It's not a fact. None of us were there, so we can't speak to it. Russ, I'm sorry.
In the beginning was the word.
The beginning was the
It's
word.
also the hallmark of Christian theology too.
Yes. Was any of us there? Of course not. Does it say anywhere in the Torah that the Torah was in existence before the world? No. Did it say it anywhere in any of the Tanakh, the prophets or writings? No. It's only in later rabbinic thinking that concept even shows up. But it was necessary. And so the world is now, God's presence is throughout the world. If only, this is very Heschel, just go out and look at the world and you will see God. Be open to it. We've all had those experiences. I've described the fact I went to the Smoky Mountains. I got out of the car and I said a bracha. Like this is God in action. We've all had those moments. But the rabbis wanted us to think that was the intent all along. Torah became core, but it really only became core post-temple times. There is a shift. The reality of it is there is a shift that happens here. It goes from priest, sacrifice, temple, to the world as the temple. The Jews are the priests, and God's presence is now everywhere. There is a blessing. If you meet a friend you haven't seen for a year, the blessing is Michayeh Ametim, the dead has arisen. Right? Blessings became that ritual. It became the sacrifice. Now I'll take questions. I can't believe none of this isn't bothering you.
So I have a question unrelated to this. When did Ezra live?
Ezra's around the 4th century before the Common Era.
what were the other unsuccessful responses to the destruction of the temple besides Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism?
So well, first of all, a lot of them died out. Okay, and that's part of the sectarianism we'll look at next week. Okay, yeah, because most of the sectarianism, all the other groups died out, but they were trying to struggle with it too. I'm not sure beyond either our God is not as capable is one answer. Two is that we are at fault, and therefore if we double down. And Christianity came up with a third answer, and that you misunderstood what God was saying, and this is really what the intent is. I'm not sure what other large picture ideas there are in response. All right. I'm going to take the Talmud's statement of silence is agreement. Next week, we will look at the different groups of the time, because of the tension of the two groups now coming back, those who were in exile, those who were still in the land, their understanding of how best to relate to God, and that conflict that arose as a result led to the sectarianism, and that's what we'll look at next week.
What
Yeah.
What about the Jerusalem Talmud? When did that come into?
So the Jerusalem Talmud, today I only dealt with the Mishnah. All right, the
Right.
Talmuds are late, and that's 200 Common Era. The reason I didn't go to the Talmuds too much is because it's actually later. So the
It's
Jerusalem
later,
Talmud is
okay.
finished around 400, some 400s, and the Babylonian Talmud in the 500s.
Okay,
But it's a much later interpretation of what's happening.
because what we practice is based more on the Babylonian. Right.
Yeah, we are right. And again, that is like everything else. To the victors go the spoils. Okay.
Okay,
All right. The the Jerusalem Talmud in the community in Israel was basically decimated. The Jerusalem Talmud is finished. Who gets to write the last statement in the next 100 years? Those living in Babylonia. And so that's where we end up following.
okay.
If
And the Samaritans that are left there in Israel, that they are a little sect that goes back.
I'll talk
Basically
about that
goes
next week.
back.
I'm going to talk about the Samaritans next
Okay,
week.
yeah,
Yep.
because I just saw there was an exhibit that people
so
from the Jewish artist group were.
All right. So when we talk about it next week, maybe you can highlight. a couple
Yeah, I'll
things
see
for
what I
us.
can look up on
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
if you were talking to a group of people in Israel right now, would you be getting a different reaction than you've gotten from us?
No, it would really depend. I don't think it has to do with Israel. I think it has to do with the theology of Orthodox versus those who believe in the Torah as God's direct word and handed down at Sinai with the oral Torah versus those who don't believe that. It's fundamentalist versus non-fundamentalist.
You seem surprised that we're not reacting differently. I was trying to figure out what audience you think would react differently.
Well, there's two. I would answer that in two parts. One, certainly an Orthodox group, and obviously by the fact that you're sitting here with me, it's probably not likely. The other is it depends on the level of education you have. To some extent, people who have a more cursory level, this would be a surprise. If you have a greater level of knowledge, which I'm as I look at the group, there is, then it doesn't come as much of a surprise. Essentially, what the rabbis did was, in many ways, was create a new religion. And I can be critical of that, but I also can say if they hadn't, we wouldn't be having a conversation. We wouldn't be sitting here as Jews. Yeah, Russ.
What was happening in Babylonia from the time of the rebuilding of the Second Temple until its destruction?
We don't know. The record, it is a black hole in history. There is minimal writing about that. We know that, obviously they're staying there because most of them are already writing in Mishnaic times and then the Talmudic times. They haven't all gone back. Many of them stayed there. What we know is they clearly had a comfortable life because they chose to stay there. We know that they were able to maintain their distinctiveness, but beyond that, there's not a lot that we know.
You don't know what kind of Judaism they practiced or not.
I'm sorry, we don't know. I have to assume by the fact that the writings of that were generated over the generations afterwards, that some level of Judaism was continued, but I just don't know how to define that. Yeah, yeah, please.
Yeah. The reason I wasn't totally surprised was if I look at the present day Jews, one of the characteristics of Jews is that they have lots of creative genes within the people. So we're creative now, and what we had 2,000 plus years ago was Jews being creative.
Okay, so no, and I don't disagree with you, and I think there are moments in history where it is required, that a shift is required, not just a nuanced change, but a significant change. I think the destruction of the temple is certainly one of those moments that absolutely demanded it. How much, which moments are those moments? How much change is required? How does it fit and connect? You know, again, I would say conservative Judaism says tradition and change. Sometimes we're focused on change, we don't focus on tradition, and sometimes it's the opposite. Okay, that is the struggle, and that's why we're a pluralistic movement. That's the struggle we're handed. But an Orthodox Jew would say, no, that, you know, how dare you? What do you mean change? You have the exact word of God. What kind of chutzpah is that? And if you begin with the premise that it is a fundamentalist document handed by God, they're right. You have to, all I ask of anybody is that they be consistent. If you believe you have the exact word of God, it's chutzpah to make changes. Yes, Russ.
It's interesting listening to discussions about current law amongst Orthodox Jews. They refer back to previous rabbis, they refer back to the Talmud. A lot of times they forgot what part of the Torah it came from, and they can't quote the Torah verse.
They can't find it. But there is, even in their discussions, there's a distinction between that which is Rabbanan from the rabbis and D'Oraita, that which is Torah, or at least is an attempt to make that distinction. And there's some flexibility on what's rabbinic. There's no flexibility on what's Torah theoretically. We all know that the Ben Sorera Moreh, the rebellious child, they certainly played loosely at certain points. Sandy, I see you turned off your.
No, I'm still here.
Okay, no. When I see somebody turns off their, they've gotten rid of the silent. When I'm doing, I can't find words as I get older. When they unmute. Sometimes that's a cue. So, all right, my friends. We'll
before you go
ahead now.
I'd like to just say a little thing that the Orthodox actually in the last 100 years has done a tremendous amount of changing.
Well, they have and they haven't. I'm going to tell you that my great grandmother, who was an Orthodox Jew coming from Russia, would not be considered frum by much of the Orthodox world today. They've gotten more traditional.
Well, they've also gotten to accept that the female can pray in some ways. They have.
Some of them.
It says, this is current, this is the last 50 years, but there has been, so they're working around the Torah being from God,
right,
to make it work.
So there are some within the Orthodox movement, a lot of the followers of Avi Weiss and the modern, which is really in trouble, would say that. But if you were to say that to Lori, who works in our office and lives in the Fondren area, I think she might have a very different perspective.
Well, I wasn't saying all Orthodox, but
unfortunately, Natalie, the number of the change is becoming less and less. They're moving further to the right at this point.
Except for that small group, I guess. But
except for the modern Orthodoxy is in trouble all over the country.
Yeah, so
it's
like
dying out.
I've heard many people, women who are called Rabbinic,
Yeah,
because
well,
of that.
again, that is the Avi Weiss
But that's the
school,
obvious, yes.
but
yes.
much of Orthodoxy has no use for Avi Weiss.
I know that. It's,
Yeah.
it's a very small group within.
All
And
right,
they
my
allow
friends.
the women to do certain things, like when I was in Israel, and I ended up in a synagogue that Rabbi Teller knew, where the women did the, on Friday night, they did the introductory part of the service.
Right,
all
because
the-
that isn't halakhically required. So so a modern Orthodox Jew is going to look and say, what is absolutely halachic? Women can't do it. That which isn't. So the rabbi I work with Simon Potok, who's my first rabbi, Chaim's brothers. You have a sense of the world he grew up in. He would say, for example, if you have a bat mitzvah, she can lead Aleinu. She cannot finish Aleinu. I had to do V'nei Amar, because the only thing that has to be recited out loud is V'nei Amar. So therefore,
Okay.
she could do anything that had no reason to be recited out loud to begin with.
So I guess
Ashrei,
that's
she
why,
could do all the lines of Ashrei except the last two. I had to finish that.
okay, that makes sense to what I grew up with at Tiferet Israel too.
Yeah, yeah.
Then,
It's a
you know,
different
where I did a
perspective.
Friday night bat mitzvah. And
Mhm.
I believe my sister may have read a haftarah that wasn't the one for that week, honestly,
So-
for her bat mitzvah on Saturday. But I did Friday night and read Eshet Chayil.
Yep.
That was,
All right, my friends, I am
traditional.
going to cut it short because I've got a meeting to go to. We'll
Okay.
see you next week. Chag Sameach, everybody.
Thank you.
Like, so,
Bye again.